There were 26, not 13 colonies in British America. The majority of the other colonies were colonies in the Caribbean. These were places like Jamaica, Barbados, St. Kitts, Nevis, Montserrat, Dominica, and Grenada. And these colonies did not rebel at the time of the American Revolution. My interest was to find out why they didn't rebel, and also to show how important this area was during the war, and the way that this area in fact influenced the outcome of the American Revolutionary War. These islands, the wealth created by individual planters was actually greater than the wealth created in places like South Carolina and Virginia. It's a measure of the importance of this area that at the end of the French and Indian War, the government had to debate whether it was going to keep Canada or Guadeloupe. And when the government made negotiations to keep Canada, there was actually criticism in Parliament. John Wilkes said it was like the peace of God, it passeth all understanding. But it gives you an idea of the importance of these islands, that Guadeloupe was regarded as more important than Canada. It was the Caribbean that the British had initially intended to settle, and especially Central America in the 17th century. This was where the Spanish had made their wealth with the silver trade. This is where British explorers like Sir Francis Drake and John Hawkins, they looked not to go to North America, but to South America and the Caribbean. At the end of the 17th century, this island, Barbados, and this painting almost looks like an aerial view, this was the wealthiest place in English America. It's essentially symbolic of the wealth that this small island had stone buildings. There were only three large stone buildings in Virginia at the time, which was then the wealthiest of the mainland colonies. This house was called St. Nicholas Abbey, and this was a planter home that was built in the late 17th century with additions during the 18th century. If you go to Speightstown in Barbados, you will again see the homes of merchants that are again built in stone and date from the late 17th century. This, and what you're seeing, is really a view of a bay, and yet this was one of the wealthiest towns in English America at the end of the 17th century, but there's nothing of it left because this was Port Royal. And in a few hours, it was engulfed by a tidal wave caused by an earthquake, and it created what today is known as a cataclysmic archaeological site. That is a site where a moment of time has been almost completely preserved. Possibly the best parallel is Pompeii. We found more pewter, for example, in excavating this area than anywhere else in English America. Most of it only a few feet under water. This is the grave of a man who was fortunate enough to survive that tidal wave, rather like the story of Jonah and the whale. He was in an air bubble under water and lived to tell the story, but most were less fortunate. By the time of the American Revolution, The islands were doing less trade than the North American colonies. Most British politicians saw the future as being in America, but the islands still remained very important. The governor's palace, for example, in Spanish Town in Jamaica, is much larger than the governor's palace of any of the mainland 13 colonies. This is the governor's palace in Williamsburg, often regarded as the most important government in North America, but compare it to the governor's palace in Spanish Town, Jamaica. In fact, Spanish Town generally is a very impressive colonial city with its assembly still existing and court buildings. It represents really the great wealth of Jamaica during the 18th century. When Britain started to introduce policies after the French and Indian War aimed at centralizing the empire, making it more efficient, and above all, taxing the colonies, this also affected the islands in the British Caribbean. The Stamp Act was the first really direct tax on the colonies, and the stamp tax in the islands was actually higher than the stamp tax in North America. They even designed special stamps to be used in the islands with higher denominations. But nevertheless, Jamaica and Barbados paid the stamp duty. They were the only places to do so other than Montreal in Canada, and briefly, because the governor used the British Army to enforce it, in Georgia. But none of the other 12 mainland colonies paid the stamp duty. Nevertheless, the islands were not in favour of the Stamp Act or of British policies designed to centralise the administration. There were a number of planters in England who sat in Parliament. They included, most famously, William Beckford, who was the mayor of London at the time, and who was one of the only members of Parliament to speak out against the Stamp Act. There were even riots in the Leeward Islands in places like St Kitts and Nevis. Antigua did not pay the tax. In other words, they shared the opposition of the mainland colonies, even though some of the major colonies in the Caribbean paid the tax. As British policy threatened war, the islands were very concerned. They had nothing to benefit from a war between Britain and America. The war broke out at the time when the West India lobby in Parliament, and there were about 50 members of the House of Commons who had connections with the British West Indies. Many of them were absentee planters or merchants who dealt with the islands. It was too late. The Battle of Bunker Hill occurred in the August of 1775. Congress passed legislation to impose an economic boycott not only on Britain but on the British West Indies.